Hello and welcome to the Asia Tech Podcast Studio. My name is Graham Brown. This is Pitchdeck Asia, where we profile some of the best startups in Asia, and not just startups as well, but businesses of all different sizes and stripes. Joined today by Balazs Molnar. Balazs, welcome.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for inviting.
It's great to have you here, CEO of APAC for Aliz. So we're going to talk about your journey. We're going to talk about the problem that you're solving and also your team and where you go from here. Let's start at the top. You are from, and this is not a Singaporean name by any stretch of the imagination, but where are you from?
It is definitely not. It's a Hungarian name, so I'm
Budapest.
from Hungary. Yeah, I'm from Budapest, born and raised. Beautiful city.
It is.
You all should visit.
Yeah, I love it. Good coffee as well. So
very good. Yeah.
You know, the one thing about Hungary has been famous for over time, as well as recently in the tech era, is for a certain type of companies. There's a lot of companies that come out of Hungary, Budapest as well, which have been very tech focused, very much on the sort of the back end of, you know, supporting the whole internet, whether it is like Prezi, the presentation side, and you've got the data sides as well, the database builders. What is it about Hungary that produces this sort of category? I mean, you know, not a lot of people know about Hungary outside of that. With all due respect, I mean, you know, I don't know, historically you've got a big claim to fame, but in the tech space, you produce a lot of engineers and database guys. What's going on?
I think it's a good question. We sometimes ask ourselves as well, but I think what is important here is that our language is so different. So usually people don't expect this answer, but our language is so different. We don't really fit into any of the European languages. We are not Anglo-Saxon. We are not Slavic. We are not like Latin language. It's a very different language, very different logic. And therefore, I think historically our mind or our brain is just working differently. And we are traditionally very good in math, and we're very good in engineering. We invented a few different things over the course of history, like vitamin C, the computer itself. So John von Neumann is actually a Hungarian guy, Hungarian-born American scientist. And I like to take this back to the language, that we have a very different thinking, and I think it helps us to be very good in sciences in general. We also have a very strong engineering education, so I think universities are traditionally very strong in basically engineers. So therefore, we get a pretty good supply, even though the country size is very small. I mean, relatively, Singapore is close to what we have. We have 10 million people. But in terms of the size, and compared to the size, the amount of engineers and good engineers, especially in technology, is extremely high. What we're really bad at is selling.
Right.
So I think that's the that's why we have our business in Asia and our innovation center in Budapest, because we try to get the best of both worlds, basically.
Right. Okay. So you're based here in Singapore,
yes,
and your development team is in Budapest.
Partially. So we have development team in Singapore.
Yeah.
Mainly customer engineers who are based here, focusing on Asia, mainly Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore. But the larger team from the development team is in Hungary, because it just makes more sense for us to keep there. Not necessarily cost-wise. Actually, cost-wise, it doesn't have any advantage.
In Budapest?
Yeah, Budapest
really?
is not a cheap place.
Right. I suppose if you're a developer, you can charge a world market rate, can't you?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Right.
Especially that, like, these are world-class developers, so you can't really save. But in terms of the supply of engineers and the knowledge, and like just to keep, we call it the innovation center because it is really what it is. So like we basically create new things every day in terms of, you know, our workloads and stuff. So so it really makes sense for us to keep the team there. But the business is mainly here. Although we have European clients as well, but Asia is just like outgrowing everything, as in pretty much, I guess, like any industry now.
You're in the right place. Yeah, you're in the hot spot. So we'll talk about your team in a minute as well, and also, importantly, the kind of people you want to join your team, because it's a global market as well. What you're playing in is that people will look for those exciting projects they can be part of. I want to talk obviously about Aliz, but before we get there, your background as well I think is really interesting, and it sort of sets the scene here, because you've worked for some of the premium names in the tech space. You've worked for Google, you've worked for Uber, And especially now that we're sort of branching into the data analytics side of things, because these are two companies which just must have access to billions and billions of data sets. So the need for data analysis and turning that into actionable insights is so important. So you've worked for those companies. I want to know a little bit about what you did there, but also then why did you then go and then do your own thing? What was you must,
Yep.
some people must have said to you, Balazs, you're crazy. Why don't you just, stick with the IT companies you're looked after forever, right? So
Yeah.
what were you doing there first? Tell us about Google and Uber.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that like I always get that you're crazy. So like this is usually like if I say someone that what we're gonna do or what I'm going to do, they tell me that you're crazy. Like my mom, when I left Google, she told me I was crazy after 6 years.
Yeah, you're onto a good thing.
Yeah,
there.
you're in the best place in the world, yeah. And it was true actually. I still believe that Google is probably one of the best corporations that you can work for. But I was just never a corporate guy. I mean, like it was I never wanted to work for a corporation for my entire life. That's something I knew when I was 12 years old, probably. But I also knew that Hungary is a small place, and I was only 20 something when I started to work there, and it was just that feeling when the older you get, the more you know that the less you know actually. So like at the beginning I knew when I was 18 or 16 I thought that I knew everything. Yeah. I got a little older. I started to feel I don't know everything, and then I got a little older, and then I knew that probably I don't know nothing, and so that's what I felt like basically when I made the decision of okay, this is probably not the right time to go to just try to do my own thing at the beginning of my career. So I started to work in corporations basically, and that led me to Google after a point, which is obviously a place where I think if in any point of your life you have the chance to work at Google, you should just go for it. And I tell this to everyone, which turned out to be probably the best decision of my life to go to Google. But again, back to that, the reason was that I just had to learn, I had to learn, I had to understand, what's out there, especially when you live in your small country, in your small little, within your borders. No matter how much you travel, you just don't understand how things work. And that's something that you realize more and more as you get older. At least I do. So now I know that I still don't know anything. So basically I started to work in the corporate world. That led me to get a job at Google.
6 years, right?
And then, I was there for 6 years, which is a tremendous journey.
In Google search as well. So it wasn't one of the side projects. It was the main thing.
Yeah,
right?
the core business. I started in Europe. I did a bunch of different things there, mainly around acquisition and the core business for ad sales. But then when I came to Asia, I was basically asked to come here to help people to get online, which is a super exciting thing. We had an initiative back then which helped people to get free internet access on feature phones. This was 2013, mainly in Southeast Asia, India, and Africa. And then this initiative quickly evolved to something else, because then we realized that actually people in these countries were not searching anymore. The internet was a closed environment for them. They mainly came to social media to post pictures, and it was very, very limited experience that they got. So the team that I was part of, and then later I got to lead, basically we came up with the proposal that we need to make search sexy again, because for these people search meant nothing. They didn't understand what the open web was. They didn't understand how much they can actually get out of going to the internet and search and go on a journey of finding out different things and learn, etc., etc. So that was amazing, and I think we still see the results, and Google still sees the results of how search grew back basically from almost a lost position. Just to give you some numbers, Android would have grown 10x, and search usage only grew 2x on Android. So that was sort of the stage that we've seen. And I think now it's in a much healthier position, and people in Indonesia and India and parts of Africa now understands much better that the internet is way more than just getting into social network and free messages and stuff, but you can actually really get a lot more out of it. So I got to work on search, which is amazing. I got to work on some of the most advanced technologies, like voice search, like predictive stuff that helped you to get better results. So a bunch of different things. It was really like something that I wouldn't change for
Absolutely. It's a great education.
Anything. Yeah, exactly.
And working with great people.
Yeah, like the best people.
Because people often say, you know, like in the startup world, obviously, that you want to get out there, you want to start a business, and that's how you learn. But there is another way, which is like you can go and work in a great environment. Google, which is startup-like in its thought processes.
Yeah.
It's not two guys anymore, right? in a garage.
In a garage, yeah.
Those days are over. But very much the way they approach, and also, I guess what I'm curious about, and this sort of leads us into Aliz as well, is that what you learn in terms of how you go about a problem like that, which is, okay, how do you make search sexy again? How do you bring it back? You can have sort of the gut instinct about how to do it, but I guess it was a data-driven strategy, wasn't it? I mean, what did you learn from Google in terms of, making those strategic decisions for a business using the data? Because this is sort of a new thing really in business. In the old days, it was like, okay, I'm the CMO, I'm the head of marketing. I think we're going to do this because I've seen it somewhere else and it looks all right. Whereas I don't think they do it like that in Google, do they? It's very much like, here's the data, this is what we know. What did it teach you there in terms of making those decisions?
Yeah, I think and it gets back to the same data point that I just mentioned, that the myth, right? Like there's a lot of myth everywhere. If you go to any company, half of the workloads are actually managed on myth. It's like things that are, we think that is going to happen. So for example, the biggest myth was that Google search is used by everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Like it makes sense, right? Like you use Google search, your friends are using Google search.
All your employees,
all your employees.
Yeah, exactly.
If you go to a company in Indonesia and look at what they use Google search, but that's not the case when you look at the numbers, right? Like very simple numbers. Android grew 10x, search usage on Android grew 2x. Something is wrong, right? Like people are not using search anymore. They're using something else, and it's not necessarily the thing that they're using another search engine, because there was no other search engine that they were using. They were just not using search. And that was it was a really difficult thing to make people understand outside of Southeast Asia. People who are sitting in San Francisco or wherever, it's just so distant from the real world. It's really hard for them to understand. I remember first presentation about the Philippines, and then like the most important thing that people ask, like, I didn't know that the Philippines was 100 million people.
Right, there you go.
Yeah. It's like, okay, so maybe that's an actually important market.
Yeah.
Look at.
Southeast Asia, there's a lot of those. I mean, Indonesia is 250 million, right? So
I think Indonesia is a place which people generally know because it's the fourth largest country in the world. It's the largest Muslim country in the world. They have a lot of like largest, But like places like the Philippines, people didn't even know about, like, this is 100 million people. I think now it's close to 110 million people with like 60% internet penetration now, like something like that. So I think like there's a lot of myth busting that has to happen in these companies, and even at Google, to be fair, without like trying to, getting into, maybe they change their processes, but
but that's natural, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, like, human beings.
Yeah, we are human beings, and like half of our decisions are, even though like they taught you to base everything on data, but like we, sometimes we just know it better, right? And humans. Sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes the data just can't give you the instinct that as a human being you have, but it's always better to back it up, right? So. So I think that helped a lot in terms of understanding that, how we can actually bust those myths. And like actually data helps, because like powerful things like these Android numbers that I said can really help you to make people understand, like, if you have a problem, if you have an opportunity.
Yeah.
Usually when you have a problem, you have an opportunity as well, right, to solve. So basically that was a very, very important journey for me at Google, understanding like how to use the data, how to make better decisions, and how to convince other people to make better decisions who you know, like you might not be in the position of making certain decisions, but using data, you can actually make those. So that's one thing. The other thing is, which is very important, and this is pretty much like what we do, is how you can use data to automate things.
Right. This is moving into Aliz, right? So
yeah, but in some way it relates
starts
to
at Google.
Google.
Right,
Yeah,
absolutely.
exactly. Because like most of the companies, and even now, like I'm talking to CEOs of large companies and CTOs, and often the first conversation starts with how we can automate things in machine learning. How can we use this AI thing? And, you know, like all these buzzwords that are out there. And my first question is, do you get your data right? Because in a way, people know that like anything that you want to automate has to start with data. But on the other hand, it is a bit less sexy, you know, because like nobody cares about the plumbing, right? Like
Right.
they don't want
Yeah.
to look at it. They want to look at the beautiful house and how does it look like. But actually, everything starts with the plumbing. You need to get the plumbing right. You need to get your data right in order to be able to automate things. And this is something I learned at Google, to be honest. Like, I mean, like Google handles more data than anybody else. Google does more automation than anybody else in the world. And basically this led me to thinking that like basically we need to start everything from the data. And even if AI, or I don't like to say AI because it's not a technology, but machine learning is actually based on data. And if you don't get your data right, you can just dream about these things, you know?
Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
yeah.
Okay, well, what I want to do is I want to look at your deck and have a
Sure.
quick look at that. But before we go into that, I'm really fascinated by this idea of not getting the data right, because I completely agree with you. And I'm curious as a startup founder myself. It's like, you know, let's talk about what the problem is. What is the problem there? Why are people not? I know, you know, there's it's not sexy part as well, but there's a human aspect in there as well, which is kind of getting in the way, isn't it? Why aren't we getting the data right? You know, is it just that we don't know how to? And what does it mean not to get the data right? I mean, if we took as a very basic case study, a small company like Asia Tech Podcast, we gather data about, you know, the sign-ups, the conversions, the newsletters, the traffic, the views on this interview, for example, all of that, we gather that. And so where would, you know, in your understanding of the companies that you sat with, where did generally companies get it wrong at the, you know, step one? How do they approach that in the wrong way?
Yeah, I think it's in terms of, it's also a matter of size, right? Like how much data you get. Like in terms of like a size of a startup, which gets like, you know, not that significant amount of data, then it's easier to sort of like, you know, collect it in the right place and like use it as the one single source of truth. But usually it gets a little more complicated when you get a lot of different data, like especially like companies who would sell online. No matter if it's an OTA, like an online travel agent, even like an airline or an e-commerce, anybody who gets a lot of traffic, a lot of measurable data points. Usually those data points are going into different silos. Traditionally, data warehousing was a very expensive and robust project that had to happen in only large companies. And like, you know, we talk about big data for the past 20 years or even 25 years, right? Like it was always there. But it was a privilege of like these large companies. They built these like massive data warehouses in their like basement, basically, which didn't really evolve over time. Like it was really hard to get those into the new, you know, like those data warehouses pretty much the same as it was like 20 years ago, and they still usually sit on those data warehouses. And it's hard to apply different like modern machine learning algorithms on them. It's just like, you know, it's just data are sitting in silos. So there are different things in different companies why it's just not fixed. Like think about again like the plumbing, right? Like maybe if you go to a country where all the pipes are all over the place, it was built like 50 years, 60 years ago, usually you need to upgrade those. And then like I think what the problem is that this upgrade just didn't happen in most of the companies, especially like these traditional large enterprises like your telcos, your banks, your airlines, whatever. Because it was just a lot of investment 20 years ago and the world just moved on, right? So I think that's number one. The other thing is that again, it's just not sexy enough. Like people would like to jump ahead and say like, okay, I want to automate my entire marketing with machine learning.
Right.
Ideally, I don't want anyone to look at it. I just
Just
want to press the button
Yeah.
and then like throw it out there and collect the money and like, you know, the acquisitions
off
and
into
stuff.
the
Yeah,
sunset.
exactly. And then I usually, that's fine. That's really good. That's a good vision. But first we need to spend a year to build up your,
Right.
you know, underlying platform
The
that
pipes.
will,
Yeah.
the pipes that
Yeah.
will understand like where to put that money, because
Right.
otherwise you're pretty much fishing with dynamites, right? Like
Yeah.
you maybe have a lot of money to spend, but you just throwing the dynamites in the ocean and then the fishes will come up, but you never know if you can actually go for the big fish, you know?
Yeah. It's not sustainable, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think like that's another challenge, or where companies need to change their mindset that sometimes it's much faster if you actually fix the basics on the data front, and then you try to do all the sexy stuff.
Gotcha. All right. Well, let's just get the deck up, because then we can actually have a look at your solution, and maybe we can jump. It's about sort of slide 6 or so. If we can just sort of slide through. Keep going. So we can go back to that graph there, because that's that's the one, from raw data to optimizing process. Can you talk us through this? And I think it's important that we get across as well that your solution is built very much on Google building blocks,
Yes.
right? You haven't sort of reinvented the wheel, and Google's done a really good job of this. Just it needs somebody to implement this in the business world, and you speak Google's language, you speak business's language, and so you can easily, cross these two worlds. You're a bridge between them. Tell us a little bit about what this graph means. And by the way, some people may be just listening to it, so maybe you can be a bit sort of descriptive. So this is about from raw data to optimizing processes. What is this about? Is this sort of is this sort of depicting what the challenge and what the problem is? So maybe you can talk about it.
Exactly. I mean, like, I think this is, I really like this chart. I didn't invent this. I took it from a Google presentation or somewhere.
There you go.
But basically the point here is that if you look at the lower quadrants, which is like raw data, clean data, and like a few other steps, these are traditionally what you've been able to do in the past, I don't know, like 20 years. You were able to collect the data, you were able to analyze the data. Usually you had to wait for a week or sometimes 2 weeks to get the data into your data warehouse and being able to, understand what was going on. But pretty much the point here is that you were only able to understand what happened in the past, right? Like you didn't know like what's going to happen. It was really hard to apply predictions. It was really hard to even segment customers, because there was just no, even the largest companies like telcos didn't have the firepower. They didn't have the computing power to be able to analyze and to be able to segment and apply deep learning onto these data sets. So it was just not very important, I guess, for them. So they were happy by understanding what happened in the past, so they were able to measure and try to, set their KPIs and OKRs, etc. So this is like traditionally what happened, and this is sort of like what we call on-premise data warehousing, but like, it's a bit of a generalization.
But that's the past.
Yeah,
right? That's how we did it.
Yeah, exactly. That's how we did it. And what we do is basically we like to start either greenfield or just like take one workload, especially if it's a large company, and start to apply, as you mentioned, Google's technologies, start to apply some of Google's data warehousing solutions and channeling the data. And then that's when, as we used to say at Google, that's when the magic is going to happen, because basically that's when you can start to apply different machine learning algorithms. Right. That's when you can automate things. I'm a large believer in automation, and this is pretty much why I'm doing this, what I'm doing, that it's not just about like making decisions automated, but basically making processes much more effective. And being able to predict what's going to happen in the future. So like being able to be much more precisely tell how many customers you're going to get. What is the LTV of a customer that you might going to get? So you will be able to target them better. You will be able to create a much better experience.
So just so I understand, the way that this sort of pans out is that in the current world, as it stands, with those sort of business owners or people in charge of departments, marketing officers or whatever, who are charged with trying to predict and automate their processes. They're going in and trying to build that on what's on the left-hand side, the old school. And what you're saying is that just doesn't work, because that's like trying to build a nice house and the pipes are all screwed up underneath, and it's just going to blow up at some stage, right?
Yeah.
It ain't going to work. You've got to start greenfield, like you're saying, coming with these
Most
building
of
blocks.
the cases. Yeah, most of the cases. You gotta, and this is what I'm always saying, you gotta get your data right first. You need to make sure that your data is in the right position to be able to apply these things. Once that's done, and these are not that big projects. I mean, traditionally, these data warehousing projects, they were like multi-million dollars, like, tens of millions of dollars sometimes, and took like 2-3 years. It doesn't have to be that anymore. And this is why we were fascinated by the technologies that Google came out in the past few years. And to be fair, like all the other cloud providers, we just believe that Google is way ahead of the game in data and machine learning. But that's why we started to focus on this, because basically we said, like, okay, so we got all these beautiful building blocks now. You don't need to build a one-size-fits-all solution, because basically we can standardize at least half of the processes of building these solutions, but the other half is always gonna be custom. But since we got all the building blocks, it's just a matter of mindset change and the integration process. So that's what we pretty much doing. And like people who stuck in the lower quadrant of that chart, it's gonna be really hard to get to a future-proof solution.
It's gonna take time.
Yeah, I mean it's gonna take time. It's probably gonna take forever, because if you're
a few
there,
lifetimes, right?
Yeah, if you're there,
good luck.
Yeah, good luck.
Exactly. Oh, let's go back. You've got a case study in here, so people can kind of understand how this actually pans out when you implement. If you can go to slide 12. You've got a few case studies in here, but I'll just pick this first one out. Sorry, and it's the next slide. You've got a whole bunch of case studies. So if we go to slide 12 again, if you could just flip back there in terms of your implementations. If you are listening along, there's a whole bunch of very well known names there that you've worked for, you're working with Aliz there. On the slide, you can actually see it. We'll scroll down. I want to actually go to one of the actual case studies. So that was the slide 13, if we can just sort of pop up there. Recommendation. Now, is this to do with, so just want to understand it a little bit better, the case study about recommendation in terms of marketing recommendation, consumer recommendation in the old school worlds of net promoter score and so on? This is like the gold for CMOs now, isn't it? Oh, we got to improve our net promoter score. How do we do that? We do a survey, or what are you talking about? What are you doing here? This is Next Digital, so maybe you can talk through a little bit about this case study.
I think it's easier if I just give you a little more generic update, and then you will understand what you can do in the media. This is a media business, but I think in terms of general recommendation, does two things, right? Like one is that you give a better customer experience, which is obviously going to raise your NPS, and you're gonna have a better product, which is pretty much I think that's the main goal of every single company, right? Especially if you're a startup. And the other one is when you're a CMO or when you're a marketing manager, and then you want to be better in terms of recommending or better with your ads, recommending stuff for the customer, right? Like you want to better segment, you want to understand which customer can drive you, can have better lifetime value, attribute, and all those different things. So these are two separate streams, but it relates to the same things. In terms of recommendation in the media industry, it's very straightforward, right? You want to read articles that you're interested in. So how you can actually get better recommendations when you're a news outlet. Usually what we've seen, and we work with a bunch of other media companies around the world, that one of the main reasons why people would delete their news applications is because the annoying pop-up recommendations. So it's something that you get all these articles that you're actually not really interested in, right? Yeah. And they usually recommend the same stuff for everyone. You get the same articles as I get, and pretty much there is, for example, my favorite news outlet in Hungary, which we don't work with, unfortunately, but they always gives me completely irrelevant notifications. So I already know that I read them because I like them, but I already know that when I get the pop-up notification, it's not going to be interesting. Yeah, it's not going to be relevant for me.
Right, but you're a bit forgiving there because there's an emotional attachment. For everybody else, you don't give them that sort of space, right?
That's it's a different topic. Unfortunately, there is not many other news or media outlets these days to read in Hungarian that is not related to certain political systems. But anyway, so so basically that's I think that's a good example of how you can actually create a better user experience. Another good example in recommendation is Spotify, which is probably my favorite example. Unfortunately, it's not us behind; they did it themselves. But basically, once if you're a Spotify user, once they started to apply a new data warehousing and machine learning solutions, which was, by the way, built on Google's technologies, that's when the discovery feature just really changed the game. And I think that doesn't need to be explained to most of the people who actually use Spotify, because I think, like, for me, it completely changed my experience with music, because basically now I just discover a new music every day, and it's not even the same genres, like I started to listen to genres that I didn't even know I like. So it's amazing. So I think that's a very, very good example of how recommendations and how data combined with strong machine learning capabilities can change how you actually create product experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key there is it's not radically different, is it? I mean, even if you take Spotify as a case study example, is that they're not producing something which is a paradigm shift. It's just better process.
Yeah.
It's just they have this data, they're using it, and even if they produce a 20% more accurate recommendation, once you sort of add up all those marginal gains in the process, it produces a so much better experience. They're not going in and saying, look, you've all got a recommendation wrong. It doesn't work like, this and I know that, it's semantic net and so on. It's completely different, completely different paradigm. They're just saying, let's improve the process. And once you sort of like add that up, it compounds up. The end experience for the user is so much better.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen a great example of this the last few months. Before I want to talk about your team as well. I mean, we're coming around to that, the kind of people who may be interested in these kind of like applications. Chinese company ByteDance and TikTok.
Yeah.
TikTok now is the world's most valuable startup at just under 80 billion. And I read an article with them. Yeah, 80 billion out of nowhere, from 0 to 500 million. And they said, everything we do is driven by data and machine learning.
Yep.
And all they are is just like some karaoke app for kids, right?
Yeah.
And it's all about recommendation. Oh, you like these two girls like singing this like, Rihanna song? You also like this one. So it's not radically different from what we know already. It's just they're using that data. They've got a great process and they're just applying it. And the results are just phenomenal. From 0 to 500 million. Nobody knows who these people are unless you've got like teenage daughters. You'll know, right?
Yeah.
So I guess, there are people out there that are doing this. And I guess let's sort of bring this round now to the team, because people are looking for these big projects to be involved in. There's two parts to this question. The first is, what kind of people are you looking for mindset-wise? And secondly is like, why would they come to Aliz, for example? What would be their sort of like, that promise of those big projects that they can get involved? Because people, if they could work at Spotify or they could work at Google, they're going to learn so much. These are the projects they want to onboard with. So let's start first with the team. What kind of people are you looking for to sort of be involved in these projects?
Obviously, people wants to change the world. But
do they have to want to change the world?
I think it's it's just a generic term. I think like people. I think for what we are doing, you really have to believe in the technology, and you have to believe in, since we're only using Google's platforms, you have to believe that, or you need to understand that why we are using it and why it is the best available basically vendor for data and machine learning, and why we decided not to start sort of like going into and trying to build our own stuff, because that's very important. I think it's also you have to have a strong urge to do different projects and not just like one thing, because basically, and I think this could be for some people as a disadvantage, but also an advantage. And it's mainly, I see this mainly an advantage, especially for developers, because if you go to Google, usually, or whatever company, you know, large enterprise technology company, you'd work on like a small bit of some like small product, or like maybe it's a big product, but it's a small bit still. Like you would work on, you're one of the engineer on the inbox feature of Gmail, you know. Well, what we are doing is that we run a lot of projects among like multiple different companies, like, you know, from the large Indonesian unicorns to the largest airlines in the region and in Europe. So those are ultimately very, very different projects in a way of like, you know, these companies facing different challenges. In some way, of course, is the same, but at the end of the day, since their business model is different, there are different workloads to apply what we're doing. At the end of the day, you're going to end up in like, you know, maybe working on 2-3 different projects at the same time. And I think that makes it very exciting. But that might be, you know, like you need to be prepared of like, you know, working a lot, obviously, as in every growth stage company. You need to be prepared of like, you know, talking to many, many different people who are coming from different industry background, and you need to be adjust to that. So this makes also like harder for us to find people, because it's not enough that you're just an amazing technologist, at least for the roles that we are hiring at the moment. But you need to be very strong in terms of understanding challenges that these people or that these companies are facing, and try and be able to speak their language, which doesn't mean that you just speak English, you know, like, or Bahasa.
Right, yeah.
You need to understand, you need to talk the language that these people are speaking. And as you saw, like, especially the companies, the large companies, which you would like to change, because that's what I believe we're going to have the biggest effect on each of our lives, when your bank, your tech, or your whoever, like large company is going to give you a better experience, who are sitting right now in the lower quadrant of that chart, how you can change the mindset of these people, you know, like how you can make them understand that, like, you know, you can actually catch up with the fintech companies if you're, you know, if you apply a few things that, you know, we're suggesting. So I think it's very, very important for the people that we are looking for to have strong technology understanding, being good in communicating with clients and understanding the business challenges, which is not an easy thing to find, but
Exactly.
you know, challenge accepted.
Well, I want to ask you about that, because you're not just asking for builders. You want people who know that world, whether they're speaking to an airline CMO or a CTO or some enterprise company, for example, that you want people who can communicate with these. And you said something really interesting about changing mindsets. That's not necessarily found, you know, regular skill set in the developer world. They just sort of, they're engineers, they build. You give me a challenge, I'll build it.
Yep.
They're not sort of going in there and saying, right, we need to talk about machine learning, or we need to talk about your strategy, or we need to sit down and look at your vision here and your competitive analysis. That's almost like a management consultant as well. Yeah. So you've got an interesting mix. What sort of backgrounds do you think would really work in this scenario? Are they people that came from Google, or are they people that come from different backgrounds, the startup world, you know, academics, or what do you think would work here?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, because we see like all these three backgrounds can work. I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to the person, and like I think number one is really the communication skills. So I usually start with that, and I don't really assess the technology skills, but you know, that comes usually second. If someone fails, at least because we have builders as well, right? But like this is not something that we are right now actively looking in Asia specifically. And that's something I would say that we have a better supply. But for the people that are key, who are literally, as you said, it's almost like a management consultant. They need to have the communication skills. They need to be able to get the story through to the customer, because exactly that's the first question that they would ask, like the airline CTO. Like, why are you asking me these business questions? You know, they're not used to it. They might be used to it if Accenture or the large, you know, management consultants come in, but they're not really talking to them. They're talking to the CEOs and all these other guys. But they're not used to getting these questions, and then like sometimes they're surprised, like, okay, so why don't you just give me a quote of how much this it got?
Yeah.
And this
give
is
me
not,
the spec and
yeah,
go.
exactly. And this is not really the way it works, because we also need to understand like what you need to build. This is not something that you can buy off the shelf. And even though there are like many other probably companies out there would say like, oh, you just buy off the shelf, that never happens. You know, like even if you want to integrate a large marketing platform from Adobe, it takes like years to do the integration, and it costs a lot of money, right? So like it's not one size fit for all. Again, like that's kind of like the message, and for that these people also need to understand of where we are coming from. But I think like that's also our biggest advantage, and that's why we are better than and probably the competition, because we come from the business side. We understand the challenge first, and we never go into anything without being able to understand why we're doing the things. Yeah. So
well, you also mentioned that off air, which I think is important for anybody that's watching or listening and is interested in just reaching out to you. If they say, hey, look, I love what you're doing, I love what you're building, I want to be part of this. You describe yourself not as a startup, but as a business, a growth business. Is that a conscious thing? Is there a reason for that? Because that may also shape the kind of people that you're looking for and who should sort of reach out to you.
Yeah. I think that's a very important part. I like to describe ourselelves as a business rather than a startup, because first of all, we didn't raise money. Although I was told by someone at Y Combinator that the difference between a small business and the startup is 7% week on week, which I think we pretty much satisfied the 7% week on week right now. So in that sense, we could be a startup.
7% growth week on week is a startup.
Yeah, that's what he told me. So I said like, okay, this is 2 years ago. I said like, okay, challenge accepted also.
Okay.
So I think that's another thing. But I think what is important is that so I want to build a business rather than like, build something on investors' money. I want to make sure that it makes sense what we are doing. It makes sense for our people. I mean, I worked with startups around the world. I still work with a lot of startups, so I can see like the glory and the difficulty and all the things that can actually steer a lot of very good company and a lot of very good businesses just because they want to grow too big too soon. So I think like in terms of our growth, we at the moment we can satisfy the growth with what we make, like so basically reinvesting profits and stuff, which is probably something that in the future is going to change, not because the money, but more because everybody needs partners, and I believe in partnerships. So I think we will need also partners like people, organizations who can actually help us to get to a next level, and that doesn't necessarily mean of like dollar bills, but more of like advices, relationships, strategic partnerships, etc.
What kind of things would those be? Like door openers into new markets, geographical regions, and so on. Is there anything particular? I know you've got to start this conversation now because months down the line, this will become important to you. So it's best to sort of plant the seed now. Those people out there, what kind of companies may they be?
I think door openers, definitely. So companies, organizations, people who can open doors for us. I think once we have an open door and have ears to listen, then we, despite the fact that Hungarians usually not very good at sales, I think we are pretty good at sales now, or we get to a good level. So once those doors are open, then we are pretty good at getting in and like change that mindset. So door openers, we would like to learn a lot from other larger consultant companies. So we were happy to partner with any of the big, the big guys like PwC, Accenture, and those guys, because we see them as in a way, we see them as as something to follow, how they build processes and how they build relationships with these companies. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if you go into the enterprise space, these are relationship builds things. So we are happy to partner with them. But ultimately, the most important for us is like someone who would share the mindset, and someone who's not like someone who's sharing the mindset of like building something that is sustainable. To be honest, like that's important for any of the partners that I'm looking for. So we're not building a next Uber, so to say. We're building a business that is sustainable and can have still impact on everyone's else lives.
Awesome. Balazs Molnar, everybody, CEO, APAC for Aliz. It's been fantastic having you in the studio. Before you go, what would be the best way for people to reach out to you? Is LinkedIn your preferred channel, or you Gmail, or what works for you?
Yeah, I think LinkedIn is definitely one, but you can just shoot me an email, which is balazs@aliz.ai, which is, Balazs is a difficult one, so I will spell it out, BALAZS at aliz.ai. So yeah, Balazs is usually when people see the ZS at the end is a bit confusing.
Well, we'll put it in the show notes, so we'll help them out there.
Yeah.
And so anybody that was listening that is wants to join the team, interested in where you're going with it, potential partners as well, reach out to Balazs. We'll put all the details, LinkedIn, email, just a quick intro, say hi, watch the video, watch your interview, listen to your story, liked what you said about whatever. And that's a good starting point, isn't it? Because they've paid attention to what your journey is. And that last point you said about sharing the vision, that's really the most important thing, isn't it? Because, you're not necessarily out there raising funds and spending time doing that right now. You're out there looking for people who really want to build together with you and open up new markets.
Exactly.
Balazs, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great.